Robert had always been a part of the scenery of my life, like the dependable oak tree in the backyard that had weathered storms without losing a branch. He was my dad's brother and best friend, the kind of guy you could count on to show up for everything. From helping with home repairs to offering words of wisdom that somehow struck the perfect balance between insightful and laid back. Growing up, he was a constant presence, equal parts family, and the intriguing older friend who always had a story to tell or a clever joke to share. Yet, as much as I admired him, he had always been part of my dad's world. A world I orbited, but never really touched. That was until recently. Something had shifted, not in him, but in me, and I couldn't quite understand it. The lines of my affection and admiration for Robert had begun to blur, and I found myself hyper-aware of him in ways I'd never been before. I noticed the way his laughter rumbled in his chest, warm and infectious, or how his eyes seemed to crinkle at the edges when he smiled. The way he said my name, with a kind of familiarity that felt both comforting and electrifying, made my heart race when it had no business doing so. I brushed it off as a ridiculous crush, the kind that should have stayed buried under the mountain of reasons why it could never, would never be anything more. One afternoon, Robert stopped by the house, his presence as natural as the sun filtering through the windows. He wore that easy grin of his, the one that could disarm even the grouchiest of moods. My dad had been glued to his desk all day, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves as he worked through some kind of deadline. I was curled up in the armchair, half listening to the hum of their conversation while pretending to read a book. In truth, I was stealing glances at Robert when I thought he wasn't looking. "Fishing this weekend?" Robert asked, leaning against the doorframe of my dad's office. He spoke with a kind of casual confidence that made everything he said sound like a good idea. The weather's perfect for it. My dad barely glanced up from his stack of papers, shaking his head with a rueful chuckle. "Wish I could, but I'm drowning in work." "Maybe next time." Robert sighed theatrically, his hand over his heart, as if my dad's refusal had physically wounded him. What am I supposed to do without my trusty fishing buddy? Fish alone. "Take her instead," Dad said with a grin, jerking his thumb toward me. His tone was playful, but the suggestion landed like a spark in a dry field. I sat up straighter, startled by the turn of events. "Me?" I asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of my voice, and failing miserably. The idea seemed absurd. Fishing was their thing, a tradition built on years of friendship and familiarity that I could never hope to replicate. "Why not?" Robert chimed in, tilting his head in mock seriousness. "I could use some fresh perspective on the water. Besides, someone's got to keep me company, and you look like you could use a little sunshine." I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. Was he teasing? Probably. He was always good-natured like that, never missing an opportunity to poke a little fun. But there was something in the way he said it that made my stomach flip, a quiet sincerity beneath the humor. "Only if she wants to," my dad added, already turning back to his work. He clearly thought nothing of it, and why would he? To him, Robert was practically an uncle figure, someone trustworthy and safe. Safe. That word echoed in my mind as I weighed my answer. Agreeing to spend an afternoon with Robert wasn't a big deal, or at least it shouldn't have been. But my thoughts had been anything but safe lately, and the idea of being alone with him, even in the casual context of fishing, felt like walking a tightrope without a net. "Sure," I heard myself say, the word leaving my mouth before I could second-guess it. "Why not?" Robert's smile widened, a flash of white teeth and easy charm. "Great. I'll pick you up Saturday morning. Be ready early. The fish don't wait for anyone." As soon as he left, I sat back in the armchair, my book forgotten in my lap. What had I just agreed to? My thoughts raced, a chaotic swirl of excitement and dread. Part of me chastised myself for overthinking it. It was just a fishing trip, nothing more. But the other part of me, the part that had started noticing Robert in ways I wasn't ready to admit, couldn't ignore the possibilities. What if this wasn't just a casual outing? What if it became something more? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. I needed to keep my expectations grounded, to remind myself that Robert didn't see me the way I was starting to see him. To him, I was still the kid who used to run around the backyard with grass-stained knees and messy hair. There was no way he... "You okay?" My dad called from his office, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. "Yeah," I replied quickly, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. "Just thinking." Saturday couldn't come soon enough, and yet I wasn't sure if I was ready for it when it did. The drive to the lake felt like stepping into a bubble, one where the world outside didn't matter as much. The radio played softly in the background, some old classic rock tunes that Robert hummed along to. I stole glances at him when I thought he wouldn't notice. His profile was relaxed, his hands steady on the steering wheel, and there was something comforting in his calm presence. He'd always seemed so sure of himself, and it made me feel safe. "You've got your dad's sense of humor, you know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was warm, almost teasing. "But you're definitely a lot more patient with people." I laughed softly, unsure how to respond. Compliments from Robert were rare and understated, but they always carried weight. While someone has to make up for his lack of patience, I joked, earning a chuckle from him. "Fair point," he said, glancing over at me with a smile that made my stomach flutter. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of easy conversation and quiet moments. The landscape outside shifted from suburban sprawl to open fields, and finally to the dense trees surrounding the lake. When we pulled into the clearing by the water, the sight took my breath away. The lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the pale blue of the sky and the green of the trees that hugged its edges. The air smelled crisp and clean, with just a hint of pine. "It's beautiful," I said, stepping out of the truck and taking it all in. Robert smiled as he unloaded the gear. "I thought you'd like it. This is my favorite spot, quiet, peaceful, and the fish usually bite." He handed me a fishing rod and a tackle box, then gestured toward the water. "Come on, let's see if you've got what it takes to be a fisherman." I followed him to the edge of the lake, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. I'd fished a few times as a kid, but it had been years. Robert stood close as he showed me how to cast the line, his hand briefly brushing mine as he adjusted my grip. The touch was casual, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I tried to ignore. "Like this," he said, demonstrating with his own rod. The line arsed gracefully through the air and landed with a soft plop in the water. "Now you try." My first attempt was less than graceful. The line tangled, and the hook barely made it a few feet from the shore. Robert laughed, a deep, genuine sound that made me smile despite my embarrassment. "Not bad for a beginner," he teased, crouching down to help me fix the line. His fingers moved deftly, and I found myself watching the way his hands worked, strong yet careful. "You're just saying that to be nice," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He glanced up at me, his eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem even more striking. "You'll get the hang of it. Trust me." By the time I caught my first fish, I felt like a pro, or at least like I was starting to hold my own. Robert cheered for me, his enthusiasm making the moment feel even more special. We spent hours by the water, talking and laughing as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He told me stories about the trips he used to take with my dad and how they'd always end up competing over who could catch the biggest fish. He'd hate to admit it, but I've got the record, Robert said with a grin. I'll have to ask him about that, I teased, knowing full well that my dad would probably deny it. As the afternoon turned into evening, the sky began to change, the bright blue softening into shades of orange and pink. The air grew cooler, and Robert started to set up a small fire near the edge of the clearing. I watched as he worked, the flames casting a warm glow over his face. He seemed completely at ease, like he belonged here in this quiet, beautiful place. "You cold?" he asked, noticing the way I'd wrapped my arms around myself. "A little," I admitted. Without a word, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thermos. He poured some tea into a tin cup and handed it to me. The warmth seeped into my hands, and I took a grateful sip. "Thanks," I said, smiling up at him. "No problem," he replied, sitting down next to me by the fire. He hesitated for a moment before draping an arm around my shoulders. It felt natural, easy, like we'd done this 100 times before. I leaned into him slightly, letting the warmth of the fire and his presence chase away the chill. "This is nice," I said softly. He didn't respond right away, and when I glanced up at him, I saw that he was watching the flames, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it is," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like we were sharing something unspoken, a connection that didn't need words. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting myself savor the feeling of being close to him, of being here in this beautiful, peaceful place. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Robert pointed out constellations, his arms still around me. He had a way of making even the simplest things feel special, and I found myself wishing the night would never end. Eventually, we retreated to the small tent he'd set up earlier in the day. It was snug, made cozier by the pile of blankets Robert had brought along. The air had cooled significantly as the sun dipped below the horizon, and inside the tent, the warmth felt like a comforting cocoon. Outside, the soft, rhythmic sound of the lake's waves lapping against the shore blended with the occasional rustle of leaves, creating a serene and almost hypnotic background. I lay on my back, staring at the tent ceiling, my thoughts darting in every direction. The dim glow from the embers of the dying fire outside seeped faintly through the fabric, casting subtle shadows that danced across the enclosed space. Being here with Robert, like this, was a far cry from anything I could have anticipated. For so long, he had been this steady, unwavering figure in my life, someone I admired, respected, and perhaps even leaned on more than I realized. But something about today had shifted the way I saw him. He wasn't just Robert anymore, not in the same way. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude for the countless ways he'd been there for me over the years. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words yet, but it filled every corner of my mind. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was lying next to me, close enough that I could hear his steady breathing and feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. His presence was calming yet electrifying all at once, an odd mix that left me feeling both at ease and on edge. I wondered what he was thinking. Did he sense this unspoken shift too, or was it all in my head? I turned my gaze back to the tent ceiling, watching the shadows flicker as my heart raced. It felt as though I was standing on the edge of something monumental, unsure whether to leap or retreat. The warmth of the blankets and the soothing cadence of the lake should have been enough to lull me into sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Memories of the day replayed themselves, his teasing laughter, the way he'd show me how to cast the fishing line, the proud grin he'd flashed when I finally got it right. And then there was the way he'd looked at me when he handed me the tea, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than they needed to. That look had made something inside me stir, something I couldn't ignore. That's when it happened. At first, it was subtle, The awareness of his arm brushing lightly against mine, the warmth of his body so close that it seemed to envelop me. There was something intoxicating about the way he smelled, a mix of pine, campfire smoke, and something uniquely him. It was a scent I'd always associated with comfort, but now it felt like something more, something that made my pulse quicken and my breath hitch. I turned my head toward him, almost without thinking, and that's when our eyes met. His expression was unreadable at first, but there was a softness there, a quiet vulnerability that made my chest tighten. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was impulsive, reckless even, and as soon as it happened, a part of me braced for him to pull away, to tell me it was a mistake. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned into it, his lips meeting mine with a tenderness that made my heart stutter. The kiss was a blur of sensation, the softness of his lips, the faint taste of tea lingering on his mouth, the roughness of his stubble against my skin. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, all colliding and intertwining in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. All I knew was that this felt right, even though it shouldn't. There were boundaries, unspoken rules we were crossing, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was him. When we finally pulled apart, I couldn't bring myself to look away. His eyes searched mine as though he was trying to gauge what I was feeling. And for a moment, we just stayed like that, suspended in the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His thumb brushed against my cheek, the gesture so gentle it made my chest ache. I nodded, though the words felt lodged in my throat. "Yeah," I managed to whisper back, my voice trembling slightly. His lips curved into a small, crooked smile, the kind that made my heart ache in the best way. "Good," he murmured, his hand lingering against my cheek for just a moment longer before he let it drop. We stayed close after that, our foreheads almost touching as our breaths mingled in the cool night air. My heart was still racing, but for the first time, I didn't feel the need to overanalyze it. I didn't care about the complications or the consequences. All I cared about was the way he made me feel, safe, cherished, seen. The world outside the tent seemed so far away, and for once, I was content to let it fade into the background. As the minutes stretched into hours, we drifted into quiet conversation. Our voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile magic of the moment. He told me stories from his younger years, things I'd never heard before, and I found myself hanging on to every word. There was something intoxicating about the way he spoke, the way he let his guard down and allowed me to see parts of himself that he usually kept hidden. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, lulled by the soothing sound of his voice and the steady rhythm of his breathing. When I awoke in the middle of the night, the tent was bathed in the faint silver light of the moon. Robert was still beside me, his arm draped protectively over my waist. I lay there for a while, watching the rise and fall of his chest, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. This day had changed everything, even if I didn't fully understand what it all meant yet. But as I closed my eyes and let sleep claim me once more, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want to go back to the way things were before. The next morning came far too quickly, the soft glow of dawn spilling into the tent and gently waking us. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the world waking up around us. The birds chirping in the trees, the distant rustle of leaves, and the faint lapping of the lake against the shore. Robert was already awake, lying on his side, his gaze soft and thoughtful as he looked at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, letting the silence stretch between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt intimate, as though words might disrupt the fragile connection we'd formed the night before. "Morning," he said finally, his voice low and warm. "Morning," I replied, my lips curving into a smile. The simplicity of the exchange felt almost absurd, given how much had changed between us in the span of a single night. Reluctantly, we began packing up the campsite, moving through the motions in a quiet rhythm. Every so often, our hands would brush as we folded the blankets or rolled up the tent, and each touch sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was a strange sensation, both thrilling and unnerving. I wasn't sure what the day ahead would bring, but I knew I wasn't ready to let go of whatever this was. The car ride home was surprisingly lighthearted. The tension from the night before seemed to have melted away, replaced by an easy playfulness that felt natural and effortless. I couldn't help but tease him a little, making jokes about his overly precise method of packing the trunk or the way he'd fussed over the firewood. My tone was flirtatious, more so than I'd ever dared to be with him before, and to my surprise, he didn't seem to mind. If anything, he encouraged it, laughing along and tossing back teasing remarks of his own. At one point, as we rounded a bend in the road, I reached out impulsively and brushed a leaf off his shoulder. His hand, which had been resting casually on the gear shift, moved to my knee, and he gave it a light squeeze without taking his eyes off the road. It was a small gesture, but it sent a thrill through me nonetheless. I leaned back in my seat, my gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but my mind was racing. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet and still. My dad's car wasn't there, which meant we had the place to ourselves for the time being. Without thinking twice, I invited Robert inside. It felt natural, almost automatic, as though this was something we'd done 100 times before. But this time was different, and we both knew it. The moment the door closed behind us, the atmosphere shifted. There were no awkward pleasantries or offers of tea, no pretense of normalcy. Instead, we were drawn to each other like magnets, unable to resist the pull. His hands found my waist and mine tangled in his hair as our lips met in a kiss that was as intense as it was consuming. It was as though we couldn't get enough of each other, the boundaries that had once defined our relationship now completely erased. Every inch of my skin felt alive with the way his lips moved against mine, each kiss more demanding than the last, each touch sending shockwaves of heat through me. My hands didn't want to stay still either. They roamed from his hair to the back of his neck, pulling him even closer, feeling the tension in his body, the need in him that mirrored my own. It was as if all the boundaries we had once placed between us, those invisible lines we had once drawn out of politeness, hesitation, or fear, had completely dissolved. Nothing mattered now except the urgency of our connection. His breath came in ragged gasps against my lips as his hands moved lower, exploring, pulling me against him with a possessiveness that sent a shiver through me. I could feel the strength of him, his arms, his chest, his heartbeat, pressing into me, and I wanted to drown in it, to let go completely. The way his hands traced over my body felt like an unspoken promise, as if he was memorizing every part of me, just as I was doing with him. The hours that followed were a blur of tangled sheets, whispered words, and stolen moments. We were reckless, caught up in the rush of something new and exhilarating. For the first time, I let myself be completely vulnerable, allowing him to see the parts of me I usually kept hidden. And he did the same, his guard dropping in a way that made me feel closer to him than I ever thought possible. At some point, he stood up and grabbed me by the hair. I knew what would happen next, and I didn't mind. By the time my dad's car pulled into the driveway, the adrenaline was still coursing through me. We barely had time to pull ourselves together, scrambling to straighten clothes and smooth out hair before he walked through the door. I don't know how we managed to act normal, but somehow we did. Robert was calm and collected, greeting my dad with his usual easygoing charm, while I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to keep my hands from shaking. As the evening wore on, the weight of what had happened began to settle over me. It wasn't regret, exactly, but a growing awareness of the complications that lay ahead. What would this mean for us? For me? For the delicate balance of our intertwined lives? I glanced at Robert across the room, catching the way his eyes lingered on me even as he chatted with my dad. There was something reassuring in his gaze, a quiet promise that we'd figure it out together. When he finally left that night, I felt an ache I couldn't quite explain. I stood in the doorway, watching as he walked to his car, his figure illuminated by the glow of the porch light. He paused before getting in, turning to look at me one last time. "See you soon," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Yeah," I replied, my heart twisting in a way that was both painful and hopeful. "See you soon." As I closed the door and leaned against it, I couldn't help but replay the events of the past 24 hours in my mind. It felt like stepping into uncharted territory, thrilling and terrifying all at once. But as uncertain as the future seemed, one thing was clear. There was no going back to the way things were before. For the next few days, I couldn't get Robert out of my mind. Every quiet moment was filled with flashes of his smile, the way his hand felt on my skin, and the sound of his laughter. It wasn't just a crush anymore. It was something deeper, more consuming. I replayed every moment from that night by the lake, analyzing his words and actions, trying to decipher what it all meant. Did he feel the same way I did? Or was it just a fleeting moment for him, one he'd already tucked away and moved on from? Then out of the blue, he texted me. The message was casual, just an invitation to come over for wine, but my heart raced as I read it. The simplicity of his words didn't fool me. There was an undertone of intimacy that sent a thrill through me. I didn't even hesitate. I responded with a quick, "I'd love to," and immediately started planning what to wear. I rifled through my closet, settling on a dress I rarely wore, one that hugged my curves just right and made me feel confident. As I slipped it on, I couldn't help but wonder what he'd think when he saw me. When Robert arrived to pick me up, his eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice soft but sincere. I felt my cheeks flush, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I smiled, letting the warmth of his compliment settle over me. The drive to his house was quiet but comfortable. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. By the time we reached his place, my heart was pounding. His home was cozy and inviting, with soft lighting and the faint scent of cedar. He poured us each a glass of wine and put on a movie, but neither of us was really paying attention. We sat on the couch, the space between us shrinking with each passing minute. It didn't take long for the inevitable to happen. Barely 10 minutes into the film, I felt his presence next to me, the warmth of his body radiating closer. Then his hand brushed against mine. Just a light touch at first, almost accidental, but it sent a rush of electricity up my arm. I looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, everything stopped. His eyes were soft, full of something unreadable, but the pull between us was undeniable. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips hovering near mine. I closed my eyes, my breath catching as our lips met in the gentlest kiss. It started slow, as if we were both unsure, but it only took a second for everything to change. His hand moved from my fingers, sliding along my wrist to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The kiss deepened, and suddenly, everything else, the movie, the wine, the noise of the outside world, disappeared. It was just him and me. His lips moved against mine with an urgency that made my heart race. The kiss no longer tentative but desperate. I responded in kind, my fingers threading through his hair as I pressed myself into him, wanting more. The heat between us was intoxicating, and I lost myself in the taste of him, the feel of his warmth, the way he held me close. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if everything was shifting to make space for just the two of us. When we finally pulled away, both of us gasping for air, his forehead pressed against mine, our lips still tingling from the contact. I could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat against my chest, and it was almost as though we were sensing, breathing, and moving in the same pattern. Without a word, he stood and offered me his hand. I took it, and together, we moved from the couch to his bedroom, the space between us growing smaller with every step. There, the world outside ceased to exist. As he closed the door behind us, I felt a shiver run through me, anticipation making my skin flush. He stepped forward, hands now boldly touching me, tracing the curve of my back as he pulled me into another kiss, this one even more consuming than the last. His lips were hungry, demanding, as if he couldn't get enough of me, and I felt the same need burning in me. His hands roamed, sending shocks of pleasure through my body as he held me tighter, his embrace turning possessive. The way he kissed me, slowly at first, but then with increasing intensity, felt like an unraveling, a surrender. His fingers brushed the sides of my face before sliding to my neck, cradling me in a way that made everything feel right, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. I clung to him, my hands sliding down his chest, memorizing the feel of his skin, the strength of his frame beneath my fingers. The kiss broke, but only for a moment. His lips traced a path down to my jaw, then my neck, sending shivers through me. I closed my eyes, lost in the sensation, my breath shallow as his hands slid down my back, pulling me even closer, until I could feel his heartbeat sensing with mine again. Every touch, every movement was slow and deliberate, a dance of intimacy that had no words, just feelings, emotions, raw and real. As I lay beside him, my head resting on his chest, I couldn't help but marvel at how natural it all felt. There were no awkward silences, no second guessing, just a quiet certainty that this was where I was meant to be. His fingers traced lazy patterns on my arm, and I listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, letting it lull me into a state of calm I hadn't felt in years. Looking back now, I know it's complicated, messy, even. Robert and I come from different worlds, and there are boundaries we've blurred, lines we've crossed. But there's something about him that makes me feel alive in a way I can't quite explain. He sees me, not just for who I am, but for who I want to be. And being with him feels like shedding all the layers of pretense I've built up over the years. Whatever this is between us, it's ours. It's imperfect and unconventional, but it's real. And for now, that's enough. Stay with me and subscribe to the channel.